Are you going to the World Cup in Qatar? It is a question that I get asked a lot, both on here and elsewhere, sometimes by people who are just genuinely curious, but oftentimes by people who see it as some kind of gotcha. Oh, so you think that corruption, human rights abuses, and the deaths of thousands of migrant workers are a bad thing, do you? But I bet that you're still going. The alleged charge there is hypocrisy, which, in the year of our Lord 2022, is the worst charge that anyone can possibly be accused of. If you say that you don't believe in climate change, then you can cut down forests, deliberately spill oil into rivers and seas, and be paid handsomely to the CEO of Shell to your heart's content, and still you will be exempt from criticism. Say what you want about Bob, but at least he says what he does, and he does what he says. But if you are a climate activist who believes the overwhelming consensus of more than 99% of climate scientists, well then, Sarah, you'd best never have ever watched any television, worn any clothes, or have been born in a hospital that was powered by fossil fuels. Otherwise, you are a raging hypocrite who should never be taken seriously, and the climate crisis is actually all your own fault. Of course, if Sarah had actually never watched any television or worn any clothes, and had been born in some kind of commune powered only by sustainables, rather than in a hospital, then she would be dismissed as being a total weirdo who, whilst authentic, is clearly some kind of nutter who also shouldn't be taken seriously. I use the climate as just one example here, but this is the case right across the board. If you want to avoid scrutiny or criticism, the best approach is to be a wretched human being who believes in absolutely nothing, but to proudly declare that that is the case. It is basically the "we should improve society somewhat" meme, just played out on an industrial scale. Anyway, I digress only slightly. The point being here, because of my job and the fact that I like football, combined with my criticism of a tiny dictatorship in the Gulf hosting a World Cup, I keep reading comments and getting messages asking me what my plans are for the World Cup, whether I'm boycotting the tournament, watching the games, or if I am going to Qatar. So it seemed only right to make a video about what I will be doing for the World Cup and the rationale behind what that is. In short, the answer to the question of whether I will be attending the World Cup in person is no. There are two forms in which I could have attended the 2022 World Cup, either as a fan, just going to watch the games for enjoyment, or as a journalist, reporting on and covering the tournament in a professional capacity. Or, I suppose, a hybrid between the two, which is probably the best description of what I did for this channel for Euro 2020. I never had any intention whatsoever of attending this World Cup solely as a fan. I wouldn't be able to enjoy it for a start. I don't think that this World Cup represents an authentic World Cup or fan experience, and I would feel uncomfortable about going to somewhere like Qatar and supporting their economy, however tacitly, solely for leisure purposes. There is a scenario whereby I would have attended the World Cup as a journalist had I been asked to go out there and provide critical coverage by a media organisation that I felt confident was committed to doing just that. I don't think that was ever very likely, and I'm not entirely sure what that offer would have looked like to convince me or who it would have had to have been from, but no such offer ever came in. I could still have gone to the World Cup, off my back like I did for the most recent Euros, and have produced similar videos as I did for that tournament, but it would have felt far too much just like fan camming or vlogging to me, even if I was able to produce some interesting and critical reporting. Aside from the fact that covering this World Cup, in the same way that I covered the Euros, would have felt weird and inappropriate, and like an attempt to rationalise and justify going internally to myself, ultimately, like I say, I just wouldn't enjoy it. Besides, I produced what I very humbly consider to be the best documentary about this World Cup, or at least the best that I've seen over the last 12 months, and I doubt that I would be able to produce anything that would be more informative, comprehensive, or hard-hitting than that even if I were to go. To be clear, I'm not chastising anyone that is going to this World Cup. Personally, I would have no interest in going as a fan, but each to their own, and we do need critical voices to be present in Qatar, so I am pleased that there are some curious and capable journalists heading to Doha, and I hope that they are able to shed further light on the issues that surround this World Cup once the football begins. It should be said, I do think that the print media, very unusually in this country, is actually better on this stuff than the broadcast media, who tend to be much more deferential. There are those who say that anyone who is critical of this World Cup shouldn't attend, but all that would mean is that it filtered out any critical journalists, and you would end up with a bunch of sycophants like Jermaine Genus raving about Qatari hospitality, lauding how kind everyone has been to him, and commenting that he hasn't even seen any human rights abuses from the luxury of his 5-star hotel. It's for that reason that I wouldn't be remotely critical of Gary Neville if he was heading to Qatar solely to work for the BBC or for ITV, rather than beIN Sports, a Qatari state-owned media organisation. But I have already made an entire video about GNev and Qatar's World Cup propaganda campaign, so we need not get into all of that again. I should also add that I wouldn't be worried about my safety if I were to attend the World Cup. I have had quite a few people who very kindly seem to be concerned about my safety, telling me not to go to Qatar, in light of some of the videos that I've made about the country's theocratic authoritarian rule and this World Cup. Whilst I do appreciate their concern, genuinely, I don't believe that there would be any danger whatsoever of anything happening to me in Qatar, partly because I just don't think that I'm famous or notorious enough to be a significant pain in anyone's side, even if I am a pain enough for some of my videos to have been banned in specific countries, so I'm told, but mainly because one of the main aims of this World Cup is to portray Qatar in a positive light, and doing a Khashoggi, so to speak, would seriously undermine that goal. That's one of the reasons why I do get a little bit frustrated when people say that players and managers like Hugo Lloris recently are too scared to say anything bad about this World Cup for fear of reprisals in Qatar. They literally could not be any more insulated from reprisals or safe at this World Cup. There has literally never been a better time or a safer time to be critical of human rights abuses, but anyway, I just wanted to get that in there. As to whether I will be watching the World Cup, or at least some of the games, from the comfort of my own home, or actually whilst in Dublin for a few days of this tournament, the answer to that is yes. And in terms of covering the World Cup on this channel, anyone who is subscribed will know that I have already done that, and whilst up to this point it has largely been coverage about issues off the pitch, I will be covering the football itself at some stage. The World Cup is broadcast on free-to-air television in the United Kingdom, namely the BBC and ITV, so the games that I do watch, I will be watching either on free-to-air television or via illegal streams on my laptop whilst working, if you're allowed to say that. If not, then obviously I won't be doing anything like that. Maybe I am missing something here, and it is quite possible that I am, but I don't really see tangibly how me doing that benefits the Qatari state. I suppose if this World Cup were to have a dramatically reduced global television audience, that would be quite a powerful statement, and it would hit FIFA where it hurts in the sense that maybe the next World Cup television rights deal that they sign might be worth a bit less based upon those previous viewing figures. Outside of that though, which would seem to be quite a minor and by no means guaranteed win, I fail to see how me watching no games at all or pretending that this World Cup isn't even happening would achieve anything other than making me feel as though I'd taken some kind of principled stance. I do think a small-scale boycott of the companies that have sponsored this World Cup is a more feasible and effective strategy, which I had hoped would gain a bit more ground than it has currently done. As a reminder, since there aren't actually very many of them, those sponsors are FIFA's principal sponsors, namely Adidas, Coca-Cola, Visa, the Wanda Group, Hyundai Kia, Qatar Airways, and Qatar Energy, plus the 6 named World Cup sponsors, which are Baiju's, Crypto.com, Budweiser, Hisense, McDonald's and Vivo. I had considered totally boycotting this World Cup, especially after watching the investigative documentary that The Guardian put out 8 whole years ago now, if you can believe that it has been that long, and maybe I would have done if this wasn't my job. I honestly am nowhere near as enthused about this World Cup as any previous tournament, and anecdotally at least within my friendship group, I'm not alone on that front. I adore the World Cup. I think that it is the greatest sporting competition on earth, and normally I try to watch every single game. I actually think that the group stage is the best part of any World Cup. I love the unusual matchups that you get, multiple games a day, seeing and learning about all of the different cities that the games are being played in, every single thing about it. Of course, that last point is just one of many examples of how this World Cup differs from all of those that preceded it, since all 8 stadiums are located within just 35 miles of each other. I don't think that I will follow this World Cup obsessively, it just feels less magical, and indeed, just practically speaking, I have never been so busy with work. Another question that I get asked a lot is whether I have been offered money to go to the World Cup, since, as has been widely reported, Qatar has offered quite a lot of people free tickets, travel and accommodation, and indeed cash in some cases, in return for, well, let's just call it favourable coverage of this World Cup. It is deplorable, and quite frankly, anyone who accepts that money is a morally bankrupt charlatan who should be forced to have the image of 6,500 dead South Asian migrant workers burnt permanently into their retina. Nope, I don't think that is too extreme. Oddly enough, I haven't been offered any cash by the Qataris, despite the fact that I seem to be the only football YouTube channel with more than 100,000 subscribers not to have made their mailing list. Yeah, bit of an odd one really. It must have been something that I said. I do recall an email many moons ago from Hisense about doing some sponsored World Cup coverage, who became sponsors of this World Cup in 2021, having also sponsored the World Cup in Russia. And they sent me a very glossy online brochure which boasted that they had founded their own school and subsidised an orphanage in South Africa. I didn't respond. So yeah, today's video was a shorter one than most, but they are questions that I have been asked an awful lot. I didn't have the time to respond to each of them individually, and it just seemed easier to make a video explaining what I am doing and why I'm doing it. Before I leave you, since I wouldn't want anyone to feel shortchanged, I do just want to respond specifically to the complaint that people make about the ills of Western nations and the supposed hypocrisy of Westerners, pointing to, say, discrimination against LGBT people or the exploitation of migrant workers, and saying that those things are bad. As is quite rightly often pointed out, the West, so to speak, has committed unspeakable crimes, both past and present, from colonising most of the world to now maintaining a more subtle form of imperialism in an attempt to maintain hegemony. As it is also pointed out, since I would like to steelman my opponents, it isn't just foreign policy, things aren't all fine and dandy domestically in Western countries either. Women were recently stripped of their reproductive rights at a federal level in the United States. Italy just elected a fascist, and in the United Kingdom, despite being one of the richest countries on earth, people will die this winter once temperatures drop due to people being unable to afford to feed themselves and heat their own homes at the same time. These are all bad things. You are allowed to say that these are bad things, whether you live here or not. Just as you are allowed to say that discriminating against same-sex relationships, being a dictatorship, and causing the deaths of thousands of impoverished migrant workers are also bad things. When people say, what about X, Y, or Z, my response is always the same. Please do criticise the UK government, I know that I do, and there is plenty to criticise. Knock yourselves out. Qatar by no means has a monopoly on authoritarianism, discrimination, cruelty, or human rights abuses. Indeed, the modern state of Qatar, and all of its ills, you could quite reasonably argue, are the fault of the British. Qatar only gained independence from the British in 1971, a year after Gareth Southgate was born. Britain took control of Qatar, and indeed most of the Middle East, during World War I, after the withdrawal of the Ottoman Empire. Britain then helped to establish the various Persian Gulf sheikdoms that we know now because a hereditary monarch ruled by a single family or house suited the British down to the ground, rather than these countries becoming liberal democracies, which would have threatened British businesses and British interests. It was a very simple trade-off. The sheikhs would protect Britain and indeed the United States' economic interests through things like oil and gas concessions, such as the 75-year deal that was agreed with Qatar Energy in 1935, and in return, Britain promised Qatar military protection from aggression by land, air or sea. Hence, Qatar became a British protectorate. Although Qatar formally gained independence from Britain in 1971, and therefore ceased to be a British protectorate anymore, in many respects, very little actually changed, and indeed has still changed. The UK and the US, along with many other Western nations, still consider the likes of Qatar and Saudi Arabia to be their allies, and without them, these kingdoms would struggle to function. There would be no Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, which has led to one of the world's greatest humanitarian crises, with children starved to death and deprived of life-saving medication, were it not for the support of the United States, the United Kingdom, and to a lesser extent Germany. It's not just the sale of weapons and ammunition, but Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain are entirely dependent on the US and the UK to maintain almost all of their military equipment. If Britain were to suspend assistance to the Saudis and their allies overnight, the war in Yemen would grind to a halt probably within a single month. It simply cannot continue without us. So yes, criticise Britain. I do, and it's more than deserved. But that doesn't mean that you can't criticise Qatar as well, and whichever way you look at it, this World Cup is clearly utterly shameful and absurd. Anyway, that is it for today's video. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. I hope that you are alright with my stance on this. Maybe some of you are doing a total boycott. Maybe some of you are going. Let us know in the comments and your thoughts on that. And yeah. Feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for the channel. And you could also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens, should you wish to do so.